Hello, everyone. When it comes to changing the position values of a layer through keyframes, you have noticed in previous videos that every time we do so, a path is created in between those keyframes. This path indicates the position in which the object will be or the layer will be as it moves between those keyframes. So we can control that path to our advantage in order to avoid using extra keyframes and in order to modify the motion of our objects to make them look slightly more natural. There are several ways of doing this. The one that we've done in the past is by simply looking at the keyframes and actually using the Bezier handles that become available to us on any motion path. So, for example, let's go ahead and create a new composition. I'm going to keep the same settings that I had in the past, and I'm going to call this motion path MP. And so I am going to import Control I or Command I, and I'm going to import a file into the composition. I'm going to make it footage, even though it's going to ask me, do you want it to be a composition or do you want it to be footage? In this case, I want it to be footage, and it's just a flattened file of a retrace train graphic. So I'm going to place that in here, and let me go ahead and scale it down slightly. So I'm going to call the scaling value, and I'm going to, by pressing the S key with the layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and make it 30%, actually about 40%. So I'm going to make it about 40%, and I'm going to place that graphic here. Now, if I now change the position values for it, and I'm going to select the layer, press the P key, and I'm going to change the position values for this layer, I am going to set a keyframe here. Then I'm going to go downstream to about 3 seconds, and I'm going to move this across the screen. Now, you'll notice that the tween path that was created is connected by a line. This is the motion path that we're referring to. Now, when we look at the keyframes themselves, I can select the keyframe and I get access to the Bezier handles for that keyframe, which means I can modify the shape of the path to my liking. So with 2 position keyframes, I was able to create a very fluid path. And my graphic will follow, or my layer will follow the path that I have created. Now, I can go really creative with this path and shape it in whichever way I want. Not only that, but if, let's say, for example, I add another keyframe here, I have access now to 3 different points on a path, and I can go ahead and modify them like so. I can also break these keyframes, these Bezier handles apart, just like I would in Illustrator, by pressing the Alt key as I drag in one of the handles on one end. So I can break them to make them independent Bezier handles. Okay, or I can select them both and move them all at the same time. So you have access to the same tools that you do when you're creating graphs in Illustrator. As a matter of fact, this is very interesting because these paths follow the exact same pattern as they do in Illustrator files, which means if you have ever created graphs, which most of you have, or vector graphics in Illustrator, and you have modified the anchor points in Illustrator, you have used Bezier handles. And by using Bezier handles in Illustrator, you've already learned how to control paths in After Effects. So how does this work? Let me go ahead and import a file from Illustrator. This file is the one I will be importing, and as you can see, I have a bunch of layers in Illustrator, some of which I have named, and some of which I have retained as layers, so and so, because they're of no importance to me, things like the shrubs and things like that. But I have key things, key elements that I want to maintain by name, that I want to use nomenclature so that when I bring it into After Effects, they retain that exact same nomenclature. This is called preparing the files in another program. So if you're working in Photoshop or you're working in Illustrator, you can go ahead and rename your layers in that program and make sure that you save that file under the file format for that program. And then when you import it as a composition into After Effects, it will retain all of the naming conventions that you have created. This is part of pre-production. So when you're working with a team, whoever you're working with, make sure that you request that they actually name the layers appropriately so that when you bring them into After Effects, you don't have to play a guessing game as to which layer is which. So this file has been already prepared. I have set it up already in Illustrator. And what I want to do is I simply want to bring it into After Effects as an import, but I'm going to import it as a composition. So I'm going to go Command I or Control I on the PC. And this is the file, Layerscape Sequence. So I'm going to import that not as footage, but as composition, retain layer sizes. Remember, footage flattens my file. Composition, retain layer sizes, brings in every layer at the size of the artwork of every layer. And composition makes all of the layers the size of the composition or the artboard in Illustrator. So that file that you saw in Illustrator a second ago is 1280 by 720. So if I chose composition, all of the different graphics, all of the different layers, all would be 1280 by 720. Well, if I say retain layer sizes, each layer will be sized to the size of the artwork within that layer. So I'm going to go ahead and say composition retain layer sizes, and I am going to import. It will import it and create a composition for me, as you can see. It will create a folder with all the layers as separate files inside it, all of the layers from the Illustrator file. And it now allows me to work in that composition inside After Effects. So to open it up, I'm going to double click it in the project window, and it opens up the composition just like it looks in Illustrator, it looks in After Effects, with each layer with its own name on the timeline. So now what I want to do is I want to have that train that I had imported before. I'm going to import it differently this time. Actually, I should just keep this one. I'll use this one. So what I want to do is I want to have that train follow the path of the mountains, of the dark green mountains back here. So to do so, I could spend some time by simply going ahead and saying, okay, I'm going to bring in the train up here, and then I'll figure out where it goes on the stack after I have animated it. So I brought it in, it's gigantic. I want to make it smaller. So I'm going to select the layer, press the S key, and change its size to about 25% on scale, probably a little larger. 30% in scale would work. And I want to, my goal is to make this train follow that path. Okay, and this is a fairly easy path to follow. So I could just place my train here and then say, okay, I'll now start working on position values for this. So I'll go ahead and click P, set up a keyframe for P, go downstream to about a second, move it across to the other top of the other mountain, and then go downstream for about a second and bring it down here to about this point, maybe to this other hill, and then go about a second downstream and then bring it all the way to the end. Then I can go ahead and start fine-tuning each one of those keyframes. So I can go ahead and select the first keyframe and move its Bezier handle to try to match the path, and then go to the second one and do the same thing, place it a bit closer to the mountain, maybe move that. But as you can see, this can get tedious and time-consuming. The problem is that, I mean, this is fine and dandy for some kind of workflow. I wouldn't do this. The reason why I wouldn't do this is because it's time-consuming, like I said. So let me undo all this and show you how I can, because I understand that the concept, I'm going to move it all the way until the train is in the middle of the screen so there's no position keyframes. Now, because I understand that paths in Illustrator are the same as paths, it could be motion or masks in After Effects, these paths basically behave the same way. Therefore, the data, the information that I have from Illustrator would work just as well in After Effects. What does that mean? Well, if I can go to Illustrator and simply copy that path, just the path on top of the mountain, and then apply it to the position path of my train should follow that exact same path. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Before I do this, I want to move my anchor point for that train to the bottom of the train. So I'll use my pan behind tool to move the anchor point. I just want to bring it down here, so that's my point of reference for the motion. And that works. And then let me switch back to my selection tool and then switch back to Illustrator. So what I want to do is I want to isolate that green mountains layer so that I have access to it only, and then copy only the top portion of that graph or of that object. So in order to do so, I need to find it within my stack. So I'll go ahead and select it. You'll notice that it gets selected in my stack of layers in Illustrator, and I want to isolate that particular layer. To isolate a layer in Illustrator, you press the Alt key on your keyboard, and then you click on the eye. With the Alt key pressed, so long press it, then click on the eye, you'll notice that everything else gets hidden. All of the layers, they didn't get deleted, they got hidden. And then I can go ahead and choose my white arrow tool, my direct selection tool, and select only the top portion of the path, which is this path right here. Only this anchor points. This one, this one, this one, and this one. If I select all of those, only the paths past that keyframe, and before this keyframe, before that anchor point, and past this anchor point will get selected as well. So you don't have to select these anchor points at the end. If you do, if I select this, then this portion of the path will be selected, and I don't want that. Nor do I want this portion of the path. I only want the top portion. So I'll drag a selection across the top anchor points, and now I know that that path has been selected. Then I'll commit it to memory. Control C or Command C on the Mac. Control C to copy it. And then if I want to see my layers back again, I'll press the Alt key, keep it pressed, and then I'll click on the I for my isolated layer, and all my layers come back, and no change was done to this actual file in Illustrator. But now I have captured the path and I have it in memory. Then I'll go back to After Effects, and in After Effects, I'm going to go ahead and open up the path, the position value for that layer, for the train layer. And with the position label selected, I am going to go ahead and press Control V on the keyboard to paste. Control V or Command V, V as in Victor. So Control V or Command V, and there are my keyframes for my path, and you see that my path matches the shape of the path below it. Now, obviously, it got copied up in the air. So how do I move all of the keyframes on a path? I need to make sure that all of my keyframes for the path are selected. If I want to move them all down, I need to make sure that they're all selected. So if by chance you clicked here or you clicked here and you deselected them, simply click on the position label. This works for position or for any keyframe that you have within your timeline. As long as you click on the label for that particular property, all of the keyframes in that property will be selected. Notice that I just simply clicked on the label and they all got highlighted, which means all of my keyframes have been selected. So whatever change I do right now will affect all of the keyframes that have been selected. So if I go back with my selection tool, my arrow tool selected, and I bring that object down to match the top of the mountain, then all of the keyframes will move down along with it. And you can see now that my train matches my mountains perfectly, which is exactly what I want. Now, this is not really what I want. Two things. Number one, this is only happening in 2 seconds of time, and I want it to take longer. I want it to take the entire 5 seconds, so I need to change that. And second, my train is really not following the path. I need to orient that object to the path. So first things first, let's go ahead and stretch out the amount of time that this takes. Right now, all of my keyframes have been selected. If I want to stretch out the length of my time to fit the entire 5 seconds, maintaining the actual distance or the relative distance between keyframes, instead of moving one at a time, what I want to do is make sure that they are all selected, or the keyframes that I want to change to be selected. So it could be just these 3, if that's all I want. If I want all of them, then I'll select them all by either dragging a selection or clicking on the label, placing my time marker where I want to stretch from, in this case, the very beginning, that is my reference point, and I want to stretch them downstream. So in order to do so, I am going to long press the Alt key on the keyboard. I'm going to keep it pressed, and then I'm going to click and drag on my last keyframe. You will notice that all the keyframes are stretching, maintaining the relative position to one another in the timeline, to the distance between them, so that the time change is basically maintained between the different keyframes. Since this was a copy and paste for a path, the motion is linear. So if I play this back, you'll notice that my train now goes over the mountains in the 5-second time. And now what I want to do is I want to make sure that that train follows that path, so that it sort of dips down here and it goes up this way, it goes down this way, up that way. So to auto orient the path, what you want to do is go to Layer, and you want to go into the Transform option. And under Transform, you want to go all the way to the bottom to auto orient. You can also use the shortcut key, and that's why I hesitated a second ago, because I only use the shortcut key for this one. So the axis is under Layer, Transform, Auto Orient, or Control-Alt-0. Control-Alt-O. And so when you do that, you get the option for Auto Orient. So I want to orient this to the path, orient it along the path. So when I click OK, you'll notice that my train changes rotation, and it did not affect the rotation, as you can see. Let me press select the layer, press Shift R, you'll notice that I have no keyframes for rotation. I just stole through algorithms to the program, through an algorithm or the program to make that layer follow the path. And as you can see, my train follows that path as it goes along the mountains. So that is how you control that particular auto orientation for an object in the path. So that is a way to do that. Now remember that you still have access. Each one of these, even though they have been imported, when you select them, they still have anchor points. So if you want to fine tune for some reason or change, you can go ahead and move those around, reshape the path to whatever you want, and it will change automatically for you. However, because we brought this in and copied it from the original artwork, it should match perfectly the artwork as it looks on the actual composition. Now I can go ahead and figure out where I want to place this item. And I want to place it all the way behind this tree right here. So I need to select that tree layer and scrub down and stretch this out to figure out where this goes, which is somewhere below layer 40. So let's go ahead and bring this train layer, drag it down, select it and drag it down below layer 40 right here. And when I play it back, it should play behind the trees and behind the houses and in front of the mountains, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. Let me stretch this out a little bit so we can see what it looks like. And this works beautifully. Now, at this point, I would want to start animating things such as that smoke and the rotation of the wheels. And if this was a composition for, let's say, a children's book, then I would make some animations for the flowers and the clouds, maybe the sun to give the impression that it is pushing out light beams or something like that. And this is most likely what we will do for the next videos.